We asked what we could do for our country. We went out. We did it. With all due respect, it's time to start asking what your country can do for you.
That's Ed Markey, turning JFK's famous presidential inauguration call on its head, a clever jab at the late president's great-nephew, Joe Kennedy, who was running against him.
This is where it happened, where Ed Markey put hundreds of union workers out on the streets, selling them out to giant telecom corporations and then taking hundreds of thousands in donations from those same companies.
And that's a union leader in a Joe Kennedy ad, walking through Ed Markey's hometown of Malden and accusing him of selling out union workers through the big telecom bill Markey sponsored decades ago. This week on the Codcast, a final look at the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate in Massachusetts, a race that many think is close and one we know has become increasingly bitter and personal. I'm Michael Jonas from CommonWealth Magazine. Here to help us make sense of it all, or at least try to, are Joyce Faribault-Bowling, a veteran Boston political strategist and consultant. Joyce, great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Stephanie Murray of Politico, author of the Politico Massachusetts Playbook, who has been covering the race as closely as anyone. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're roughly a week out from the September 1st primary. Where do you guys think the race stands? Stephanie, start us off here as someone who's been on this thing every day.
So both campaigns acknowledge that it is a close race. Joe Kennedy had sort of this big double-digit lead in the polls when he jumped in last year. That gap has tightened based on everything that we've seen. But the race is still also a very open question because of the state's new expanded vote-by-mail program that the legislature passed a couple of months ago. So you can cast your ballot in the mail. You can go vote early ahead of the election, which is something we haven't had in primaries before. Or you can vote the old-fashioned way on September 1st. And because of that, the campaigns can't really use the sort of get-out-the-vote strategy that they're used to, and it's just hard to know who's going to turn out and when.
And Joyce, where do you think the race stands at this point with a week or so to go?
Well, I guess I'm really surprised because I thought that Joe Kennedy would be so much further ahead. Just by virtue of, that the Kennedy name is pretty legendary. I know people have been saying, well, not for this generation. I don't believe that. I think that the Kennedy name is, pretty legendary. I think, however, that, Markey's not like rolling over and he's showing extraordinary energy. I do think that, however, that both of them are being very negative. I like the new ads now because they're less negative. And, I kind of feel like Markey really has the edge.
Mm-hmm. What do you guys think has been surprising? Is that the most surprising thing, I guess, about the turn of the race? We know that, almost a year ago when Joe Kennedy got in, that, he didn't just sort of jump headfirst based on nothing. We knew that he'd done some polling. Obviously, that polling was, at the time pretty encouraging, and in fact, I don't know, Stephanie, talk about this a little. In fact, I think a year ago, the polling probably was accurate. He probably did have a big lead.
Yeah, and it is just kind of amazing how things have shifted. And at the beginning of the race last year, Kennedy supporters said to me, Ed Markey is going to roll over. He's going to retire. Do you want to leave the Senate this way, getting beat in a primary? No. But a very wise source who I spoke to kind of pushed back on that, even at that time, and said, this is going to be a close race because Ed Markey has his entire career on the line and Joe Kennedy has his entire reputation on the line. And I think that's why it's gotten so negative. It's so tense. There's so much money going into it. And so I think if we were all a little bit wiser and didn't underestimate Ed Markey so much, we could have seen this coming.
I don't know about you, Stephanie, but I was pretty surprised that Joe did not embrace, the Kennedy name, the Kennedy roots early on. It almost seemed to me as though, I'm going to make my own. And yeah, I know my name is Kennedy, but I have my own individual, list of achievements or whatever. I mean, I don't know what his list of achievements are, but embrace, the commercial now that embraces his grandfather, Robert, and his, great uncle. I would have loved to have seen that kind of early on, because, yeah, if you got it, flaunt it.
Yeah, what do you think of that, Stephanie? The Kennedy name.
Joyce, I think you're completely right. And at the beginning of the race, and even up until a month ago or so, there was this feeling among the Kennedy campaign and with Joe Kennedy himself that he didn't want to just run on his family name. He wanted to run as himself. He said in interviews, I think it was a story in The Atlantic, that he felt like he kind of had to overcome his family name in a way because people would say, oh, you're just doing this because you're a Kennedy. And that's even been true in the way that he's staffed his campaign. He's brought on a lot of his own people instead of kind of using the older Kennedy hands. But what really turned the tide on this is just Ed Markey's repeated kind of knocking and needling and jabbing of the Kennedy family name. He's been doing it for a few months and ramping it up as we get closer to the primary day. It was Joan Benaki who drove by Ed Markey's house in Malden to see if he was there, because, the common criticism of Markey is that he's not here. He lives in Maryland. So she went by to see if he was there, and he happened to be standing in the driveway. And he made this quip, "Welcome to the compound," a reference to the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport.
Yeah, that's really, this name, it's just sort of, I think it's sort of a double-edged sword, though. I mean, as you're saying, he kind of wanted to avoid it. Now it's almost like, it's kind of that old, with a fire extinguisher break in emergency break glass. So I think they're breaking the glass. It's an emergency and they're pulling it out. But can it be the thing that kind of get them over the finish line, or does it kind of just magnify or telegraph the sense of desperation that he's suddenly pulling out all the old family archive photos? And I don't know, Joyce, I hear what you're saying about the name, but I just keep hearing more and more people who are finding they're resenting that. And when you talk about the name, first of all, I used to think, there was this old idea that the old Irish Catholic families had the pictures of the Pope and JFK above the mantle, right?
That is true at my grandparents' house.
Okay, but that's the demographic. That's the demographic. But today the question is, for a lot of voters, do they even remember Ted Kennedy?
Look, the Markey campaign took advantage of that reluctance big time. And while it was nasty to say things like "tell your father and your brother,"
it's "tell your father,
the dirty
not
money
your father,"
and so forth. Your father and your brother. No, he said your brother, his twin brother. They all, they run it.
Right.
I think they didn't, play it just right. But here now, going into the end, it's hard to tell now. It really, really is. I am so tired of hearing the Boston Globe endorses Markey, and like the Boston Globe is, running the campaign. Because, of course, it's more than the Boston.
But it's Joyce, you said if you got it, you flaunt it, you use the name, and Markey's going to use what you got. And, the Globe endorsement probably doesn't have the weight it used to, but it's got some weight. And if it weren't the case, they wouldn't both have desperately wanted it. We know Kennedy said, "Oh, I knew I'd never get it."
Yeah, it does.
There with the elite, but you can imagine he'd have a different, take on it if he'd gotten it.
Right now, it is what it is. Markey has clawed back against the next generation of Kennedys that everybody has been looking to, kind of anoint, if you will. And, it's like the, sort of the old man in the sea. If you read that story, that poem. So it's hard to tell. And I think Stephanie says it just right. I'm not sure about the polling. And I'm not sure how much the money can buy this. I do know that personally, as a voter who has to make a choice in this, I feel it's been so nasty that I'm afraid to get my hands dirty when I vote.
Right. Wow. That is an indictment from a longtime Democratic figure in the state, I have to say. But what were you going to say, Stephanie?
I just want to go back to this point you made a couple of minutes ago about how it seemed like Kennedy was breaking the emergency glass and starting to embrace his family name. And I think that is just the perfect way to put it. I was at a press conference that Kennedy held last week at City Hall in Boston. And it was after the tell your father stuff in the debate, tell your father. And after Ed Markey, as we listened to earlier, kind of embraced the famous JFK line, but then twisted it on his head. And so then Kennedy gets up and does this press conference and says, if Ed Markey wants to talk about the Kennedys, I will talk about the Kennedys. And then here you see this television ad. You see all of this imaging and messaging on social media, bringing up old photos of his family. And then here comes an endorsement from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who says through an aide that she felt moved to make this endorsement partially because she was just so taken aback by Markey's comments on the Kennedy family. And so I just wonder if he's kind of, this has worked for him, but maybe it's sort of an Icarus situation where he's just flying a little bit too close to the sun now. The Kennedy campaign told me that they raised $100,000 just in that one day from getting Speaker Pelosi's endorsement. It clearly meant something for them.
Right. And it's interesting. I think it's true that he wanted it, but I don't know that Markey is completely upset about it. I don't know if it's going to play a net positive for Kennedy is what I'm saying. And, Markey put out this very gracious statement, and, we should take it at face value, but I think I almost had the sense that he was offering it very graciously and sort of smiling, thinking, whoa, you walked right into the trap. You got the House Speaker. That's only going to energize my base and the people who don't want this seat to be handed off to a Kennedy. And the Speaker's endorsement kind of reinforces that idea. And it gets to this whole idea that the race is upside down. The 40-some-year incumbent is the one who all the kind of insurgent energy is behind. And the young challenger is now seen as he's really the candidate of the establishment. So, Markey turned JFK's quote upside down, but I think the whole race has kind of been turned upside down in terms of how we think about the candidates.
Well, can I also say this, because we know that it was also, an old versus a new kind of formula here. It's like it's time for, new this and new that. And I don't think that Joe quite embraced the new to the extent that people feel that he's mature enough to actually, handle the situation, that he probably still needs to grow into it. And the sly fox of Markey is like, hey, I've done this, I've done that. Brings in AOC. AOC is now taking on Pelosi for her endorsement. It really has become such kind of a street brawl. And in a way, Markey and his white sneakers, even they came under the gun.
But I think that also kind of underscores that, there just is not really been a lot for them to debate on the big issues of the day because they're so closely aligned on them. So yet you still need to convey to voters that this is a desperately important choice you're making. And I think for a lot of voters, they're like, well, why? They're aligned on 99% of every issue. So they kind of almost by default, they've had to get personal or, I wrote a piece earlier this week. It's more about their character than about their positions. And so it's like, how dare, Ed Markey, whatever the charge is, that he doesn't live here or he doesn't show up to help people or, there was this effort, the most pointed effort I think that Kennedy made was with the family of DJ Henry, right? That he turned away from a father whose son had been killed. And he was like, too busy, at lunch eating his clam chowder to even look up at me. Like, and so it's not about the big issues in Washington. He's saying, what kind of man is this? Is this the man you want in the U.S. Senate? And, and there's been efforts to turn it the other way too. It's just about who they are as a person. And that leads you down, it gets you, into the mud pretty quickly.
And to that end, I was watching the final debate between Congressman Richard Neal, the chairman of House Ways and Means, versus Alex Morse, his primary challenger, who's running way to the left of him, the mayor of Holyoke. And watching them debate, it was just, I've watched, what were there, 6 Senate debates? It was just kind of amazing to watch a debate where two people, both Democrats, just disagree on so much. Because when it came down to it, in a lot of those debates between Kennedy and Markey, like you said, a lot of it was their character showing up. But when it came to questions about policy and ways that they'd vote, there's just almost no daylight. Well, which a lot of their most staunch supporters will disagree with me when I say that. But I think even when it came down to, they got asked whether they would promise to vote for a Democrat against Governor Charlie Baker if he runs again in 2022, and neither of them could do it. They even agree about that.
Right.
Well, the political correctness be damned in this race. I think we've got the oldsters saying to the newcomers, you're not just taking anything away from me. And by the way, I don't know how I feel about the DJ Henry parents piece. I think it was a good piece for Joe K to use, but I think everyone knew that the Kennedys were helping in that. And it's not to say that Markey should not have joined in. I mean, he produced a letter in which he signed it, but I just thought it was a little trite, in my opinion, to bring up like two constituents that you didn't connect with, didn't do what you should have done. I think it's just trite when you've been there for and people are saying that when you've been there for so long, so you miss two folks. Not that their issues were not important, but I just thought it also was political game.
That's interesting, because I thought obviously everything is a political move in the campaign. I thought actually it might be kind of effective. And again, back to this question of, it's so hard for people to understand what the race is about. So it just comes down to we keep hearing a lot this week about Joe Biden, and it's just his decency and his being there and being empathetic. Right. I mean, last night he's trying to be president, but we're hearing about him just as a one-on-one kind of person who can connect with people.
Yes.
So I don't know. I thought it might be that's
gets past the age.
That's kind of the move that Kennedy has. The age. I don't know. And I think the whole thing about sort of also Kennedy as the change agent or the younger thing, I think has been hard, because Markey has, in a matter of the course of this campaign, been fashioned into sort of a cult figure among young people, which is just not really the image he had in Massachusetts politics for decades. And that's, I don't know if it was John Walsh, if it's sort of the ad makers or it may just be a function of the times. I mean, I think where he is on these issues like environment that resonate so strongly with young people, the fact that, he's teamed up with AOC on that thing, I think you don't have to look far to think of a 70-some-year-old guy who also had that hold on people, who ran for president, the senator from our state to the north in Vermont, right? I mean, in some ways, we're seeing a replay of that, where people couldn't believe that, Grandpa Bernie Sanders was the candidate of the young people. But it's a little too simplistic to think young people want a young candidate. That's a little, that's just very oversimplified these days.
First of all, for some reason, I never could envision Bernie Sanders as old, and I didn't look at him as a grandpa. His ideas were so vibrant and young and new, and he attracted so many young people. Really, to me, it was hard to see him as quote unquote old. And I think that, young people didn't see that either. And I think that, saying, one of Markey's commercials, AOC says, it doesn't matter your age, but how young your ideas are. For some reason, I don't see Markey as old. And, I see him also as a fighter, the kid that had an ice cream truck. And he is deliberately casting himself as the, un-Kennedy candidate. Overall, I'm seeing this is the year of the old folks. I'm sorry, but, we have a presidential candidate who's the oldest ever, 77 years old. We see Richie Neal, as Stephanie just spoke to, being challenged by a young whippersnapper. And I think that people are, it's a shift. And it's a shift in the older guys saying, you're not just going to take my seat.
Ed Markey has been in a unique position to kind of reframe himself as the way that voters see him right now. And it's because he took his kind of greatest weakness and turned it into one of his biggest strengths. So last summer, his name ID was so low, his favorabilities were so low. It wasn't like he was disliked, but voters just didn't know who he was. And that's why he had two lesser known primary challengers, Shannon Liss-Riordan and Steve Pemberton, who both saw him as vulnerable. Steve Koczela spoke to this, the president of the Massing Polling Group. Last year, he did a poll in October of 2019 that showed that 70% of voters under the age of 30 had never heard of Ed Markey or had no opinion on him. But then a UMass Amherst poll from this summer showed that he's been able to lead that group over Kennedy with 71% of support. So because voters didn't really have any idea of who Ed Markey was, and he was so overshadowed by Elizabeth Warren, he was kind of able to rebrand himself into what they would want and kind of tell his own personal story, since voters didn't have an idea of him before that. And Kennedy didn't really, the Boston Globe, I think it was Victoria McGreen, had a great story about this earlier this week. Kennedy didn't kind of early enough start making those negative hits on Markey to kind of push back on the framing that he was giving himself. And it's worked, and he has support. As you said, it's the year of the old folks, but he's got so much support from young people. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they did the Green New Deal together. She's probably his most important endorser. And a number of the progressive primary challengers who have won this cycle are with Markey. Jamal Bowman, who upset Eliot Engel in New York, Cori Bush, who just won in Missouri, she endorsed Ed Markey today. So it's this really interesting sort of marriage between the oldest and longest serving person in this race has the support from the new progressive, very young wing of the party.
And I think that the really important point you just made, Stephanie, is this idea that I shared that early on, that Markey was so unknown, and it was a mistake to think he was sort of this powerful, entrenched incumbent, because he was, he's been in Congress since the 70s. He'd only been in the Senate seat since 2013. A lot of people in the state didn't know him. I thought that was a huge advantage for Kennedy, that it was essentially like he could treat this like running for an open seat, as opposed to taking out some iconic figure that voters would have a hard time parting with. But I think what maybe many of us, I certainly didn't appreciate, was that same, sort of handicap maybe that Markey came in with, he was able to turn into an opportunity, and that was to just kind of craft a picture or an image of himself to voters who largely didn't know him. And so those of us that watched him as kind of a longtime sort of creature of DC and the House of Representatives suddenly found this guy who's, prancing around Malden in his sneakers and got kind of young people jazzed up. And I feel like Ed Markey is the guy in the dark blue suit. I mean, he's a Mr. Picture of a guy in Congress. And suddenly, when was the last time you saw him in that suit? So I think
now he's in that dark green jacket with the sneakers. And to that point, the Ed Markey hashtag on TikTok has over 1 million views. So he's become kind of this popular figure among young people. Even my editor, who does not live, he lives in DC, his kids were asking at the dinner table, "Who's Ed Markey, Dad? I see him on TikTok all the time."
Wow, that is amazing. Now they're a little bit probably maybe too young of a demographic to be voting. Well, in addition to they don't live in the state, but it's just amazing again to think that we've had that effect. So the whole race has, in that way. I mean, I kind of share with Joyce kind of this feeling of ugh, and I think a lot of us are kind of eager to see it over because it's become so nasty. But it has also, I think, as we've kind of explored here, been fascinating in the ways that it's kind of disrupted a lot of conventional thinking around incumbents versus challengers, young candidates, old candidates.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I think that's healthy, even if it's come with a heavy dose of other stuff that a lot of us, it's left a little bit of a bitter taste for folks. But I think that it's a great framing, and I think probably we'll have to leave it there until the verdict is rendered on September 1st. But I just want to thank you both, Stephanie Murray from Politico, Joyce Faribault, Bowling. It's been a great conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for listening. We will see you next time on the podcast.